carry cameras, and he'd get very relaxed on the boat. And the fact that he was bald, he looked very different when you'd see him sitting there.
I asked Duke once if
Would you believe that the chairman, Frank Sinatra, once sent his hairpiece to a party in his place because he was too tired to go? Or that John Wayne, America's greatest cowboy, had actually been wearing a wig since 1948? The golden age of Hollywood was a dream factory, and to sell that dream, leading men were forbidden from aging, forbidden from looking imperfect, and absolutely forbidden from going bald. Behind those cinematic classics lay a cover-up operation of military precision. Photos were airbrushed. The press was silenced, and $1,000 hairpieces became inseparable companions. In this video, join me as we decode 15 of history's most famous heads of hair to see what insecurities our legends were hiding beneath layers of glue and lace. If you want to keep exploring untold Hollywood secrets, hit like, subscribe, and join us as we unveil the illusions behind the silver screen. 1. Frank Sinatra. The Crown of Power and the Illusion of Millimeters. In the early 1960s, if you were at Caesar's Palace in Las Vegas sitting close enough to see the sweat on Frank Sinatra's brow, you would behold a man of flawless appearance. Under the spotlight, his signature slicked-back hair caught the light perfectly, not a single strand out of place. Yet there was an unwritten rule among Hollywood photographers: never shoot Sinatra from a high angle. The reason wasn't wrinkles or age. It was the $1,000 crown perched atop his head. For the generation that grew up with My Way or Fly Me to the Moon, Sinatra was the embodiment of absolute self-control. He commanded his voice the stage women and every room he entered. However, the paradox was that Sinatra began losing control over his own body as early as the mid-1950s. His hair thinned rapidly, just as his boss persona required an image more invulnerable than ever. Hollywood whispers tell us that every morning Sinatra spent hours with a private hairpiece artisan. He owned over 30 toupees, each meticulously numbered, preserved, and categorized. There were pieces for daytime recording sessions, others for weekend night stages. Their lengths were even adjusted by a mere few millimeters to create the illusion that his hair was naturally growing back. It wasn't vanity. It was a calculated image strategy. It is worth noting that despite his reputation for a fiery temper and authoritarian nature, Sinatra was incredibly generous to his wig makers. He understood perfectly they held his Achilles heel in their hands. In a world where power was inextricably linked to masculinity, revealing physical decay meant losing one's standing. For audiences who have crossed the age of 50, this story carries a different resonance. Even a man who once stood at the pinnacle of fame could not escape the inescapable laws of time. Sinatra didn't wear a hairpiece for style, but to protect the collective belief in an eternal, old blue eyes. In the mythology of Hollywood, a king is simply not allowed to age before his subjects. Frank Sinatra wore a wig to keep power in his hands, like a king guarding his crown from the public gaze. But if for Sinatra, hair was about power, for Carrie Grant, it served a completely different function. Grant didn't use a wig to maintain status, but to uphold a standard of perfection that Hollywood had imposed upon him, a standard so high that even the man himself couldn't reach it with his own body. 2. Carrie Grant, the architect of unreal perfection. There is a famous quote often attributed to Carrie Grant himself: "Everyone wants to be Carrie Grant. Even I want to be Carrie Grant." Few realize that this seemingly witty remark was actually a profound confession about how Hollywood assembled the most perfect man in cinematic history. Unlike many colleagues who turned to hairpieces only when age could no longer be concealed, Cary Grant began using them as an image design tool while his career was still at its peak. In the late 1940s, while the press hailed him as the benchmark of sophisticated masculinity, Grant was quietly working with top stylists to protect every millimeter of his hairline. For him, this wasn't about hiding old age. It was about maintaining a structural perfection that the audience believed to be real. Grant was among the first to request that wig makers weave salt and pepper strands into his hairpieces the moment he turned 50. No, he didn't want the audience to be suspicious. He wanted them to believe he was aging impeccably. On the set of North by Northwest 1959, director Alfred Hitchcock once recounted that Grant demanded a special adhesive capable of withstanding the wind from plane propellers without exposing his forehead line. Under the Technicolor lights, everything had to look more natural than nature itself. But behind this cold calculation lay a different man entirely. Carrie Grant was born Archibald Leach, raised in poverty in England, carrying deep psychological scars from family abandonment and a mother institutionalized for years. For Grant, perfection wasn't vanity, it was survival armor. Looking back from the perspective of those who have lived through half a lifetime, we can sympathize with this obsession. Cary Grant's perfect hair wasn't meant to deceive anyone, but to sustain a standard of masculinity that even he found exhausting to carry. That is the price of becoming an icon. You are no longer allowed to be yourself. Cary Grant is proof that perfection is meticulously designed down to the millimeter, where masculinity is polished until there is no room for error. But Hollywood didn't just need polished gentlemen in tailored suits. Parallel to Grant, they created a completely opposing archetype, the rugged, dusty man who carried the image of a nation on his shoulders. And it is at this point of contrast that the story of John Wayne begins, a symbol of masculinity, who was not allowed to look like he was trying, even though behind that cowboy hat lay a system of concealment just as sophisticated. 3. John Wayne, the Duke, and the Tape. Under the Stetson. To fans of the Western genre, John Wayne was never just an actor. He was an ideology. In the context of post-war America, Wayne represented strength, courage, and the image of a man who never backed down. And according to the Hollywood logic of that time, such a man simply could not be bald. The truth is, John Wayne began using hairpieces around 1948, just as his cowboy persona was being elevated to the level of a national icon. But instead of choosing a sleek, glossy look, Wayne made a very different request. His hairpiece had to look a bit ugly. Not too neat, not too perfect. It had to look like it had just survived the winds and sands of Monument Valley. In scenes involving horseback riding or brawls, Wayne always used an elastic band hidden beneath the brim of his Stetson hat to secure the hair. Costume assistants recalled that he endured the heat and discomfort as long as the audience didn't feel he was grooming his appearance. To Wayne, masculinity wasn't allowed to look like it was trying. There is a legendary anecdote whispered about a charity event in 1974 when a sudden gust of wind dislodged his hairpiece in front of a crowd. Wayne calmly picked it up, placed it back on his head, and quipped, "At least it's not as fake as politics." The crowd roared with laughter. That moment highlighted the distinction between Wayne and many other icons. For mature audiences, this is where John Wayne commands respect. He didn't wear a hairpiece to deceive, but to serve the national role he shouldered. When he was old enough and his stature great enough, he no longer feared discovery. Wayne reminds us that masculinity lies not in the number of hairs left, but in how a man faces his body's decline with a defiant smile and honesty to himself. From John Wayne, the rugged American archetype who wasn't allowed to show weakness, Hollywood shifted to a different kind of masculinity, quieter, colder, and dangerous in its silence. If Wayne represented strength displayed under the desert sun, then Humphrey Bogart stepped out from the shadows of bars, cigarette smoke, and noir angles where even fragility had to be carefully concealed. 4. Humphrey Bogart, a medical diagnosis and the inseparable fedora. Unlike his peers who lost hair due to genetics, Humphrey Bogart's story carries the tragic tones of a medical chart. In the mid-1940s, at the peak of his fame, and during his tumultuous marriage to Lauren Bacall, Bogart began discovering abnormal patches of hair loss. Doctors diagnosed him with alopecia areata, a direct result of heavy drinking vitamin B deficiency and chronic, unrelenting stress. To the public, Bogart was the cool Rick Blaine in Casablanca, the embodiment of impenetrable, gruff masculinity. But in the makeup room, he was a frightened man. Bogart's fear wasn't of aging, but of emasculation. He was obsessed with the idea that his young wife, Lauren Bacall, 25 years his junior, would see his physical decay. Bogart didn't choose a glossy cover-up. He and the experts at Warner Brothers played a masterstroke. They created sparse, stiff hairpieces that were never over-groomed. Bogart's wig always looked a bit greasy/matted, fitting perfectly with the haze of cigarette smoke that always surrounded him. This tactic was so effective that audiences believed the scruffy look was the natural style of a tough guy, not the concealment of a patient. The legend of the fedora hat was born here. It wasn't just a prop, it was a shield. Even in his final days fighting esophageal cancer on his deathbed, Bogart maintained the habit of wearing his hairpiece when receiving guests. Viewers who understand the complexities of life will recognize a poignant truth. The toughest man in Hollywood was in reality the most vulnerable to the judgment of appearance, wearing that mask until his very last breath. If Bogart used shadows to hide his fragility, the next man faced a much harsher problem: how to keep the hair standing when the entire body is in constant motion. 5. Bert Lancaster. A heart-stopping moment. Not in the script. Forget the galas and award ceremonies. The story of Bert Lancaster's hair is most dramatic at 30 feet above the ground. In 1952, while filming the adventure movie The Crimson Pirate, Lancaster, originally a circus acrobat, insisted on performing a dangerous rope-swinging stunt himself. On the set in Italy, the tension was palpable. The director feared for the actor's life, while the makeup team feared for the hairpiece. With a mid-air somersault, centrifugal force could easily hurl Lancaster's secret to the ground in front of the camera lens and hundreds of extras. Lancaster didn't view hairpieces as jewelry. He viewed them as a part of the body that needed reinforcement. He required makeup artist Robert Schiffer to use a specialized industrial adhesive typically used in medicine to seal wounds instead of standard spirit gum. Furthermore, they braided the remaining natural hair at his temples into the lace of the wig, creating painful anchors. Every night after filming, removing the hairpiece was pure torture, often leaving red welts and bleeding on his scalp. But Lancaster accepted the physical pain in exchange for the integrity of his image. To him, masculinity was a complete sculpture, and if nature didn't grant him the hair of a Greek god, he would use his endurance to bolt it on whatever the cost. In middle age, when the body begins to slow down, the hairpiece helped him maintain the illusion of an ageless god. Not to deceive himself, but to meet the expectations of an audience not yet ready to accept that even the most perfect body has an expiration date. But if Lancaster used iron discipline to uphold his image, the next man chose a more subtle path, controlling the audience's belief through calculated normality. 6. James Stewart, the returning soldier and a gentleman's compromise. James Stewart's story begins with a historical silence. Before World War II, he was the young man with flopping hair in the Philadelphia story. But when he returned to America in 1945, after dozens of bombing missions over Germany, as an Air Force commander, Stewart was a different man, aged gaunt, haunted by what we now call PTSD, and notably his hair had thinned almost entirely at the crown. Preparing to film the classic It's a Wonderful Life director, Frank Capra looked at Stewart and knew they needed a makeup miracle. But here lay the problem. Stewart refused to look like a movie star. He wanted to look like George Bailey, a man beaten down by life. This is what made Stewart distinct and respectable. He didn't demand a thick head of hair to reclaim his youth. Instead, he worked with MGM's hairstylist to create toupees that accurately simulated the aging process of an ordinary middle-aged man, a receding hairline, a thinning crown that exposed the scalp under harsh light, and a blend of gray at the temples. Stewart turned artifice into a tool for truth. He understood that post-war American audiences needed empathy. They needed to see a hero with flaws just like theirs. For the next 30 years, James Stewart's semi-bald hairpiece became a symbol of sincerity. He taught us a profound lesson. Sometimes the best way to keep a secret isn't to hide it completely, but to reveal it in a controlled manner, so people believe in your character, rather than scrutinizing your appearance. James Stewart maintained the audience's trust through moderation and consistency, an image calculated never to raise suspicion. But not every Hollywood man could live his entire life in such balance. For the next star, the story takes a darker turn, where the hairpiece is no longer a tool for trust, but a sign of a cracking aura, and that is where William Holden enters the frame. 7. William Holden, The Itch Under the Jungle Heat. Ceylon, now Sri Lanka, 1957. The set of the bridge on the River Kwai lay in the heart of the tropical jungle, where temperatures regularly exceeded 100 degrees Fahrenheit and humidity suffocated every breath. Forget the dapper image of William Holden in Sabrina. Here he stood amidst mud and sweat, preparing to step into one of the most grueling roles of his career. On-screen audiences saw beads of sweat rolling down the character Shear's forehead, creating a raw, weary, yet proud masculinity. Off-screen, Holden was enduring a different kind of torture. The wig adhesive began to melt, mixing with sweat jungle dust and tropical bacteria, causing an itch that drove him nearly mad. William Holden was once dubbed Hollywood's golden boy of the 1930s, but by the 1950s the gold had tarnished. Heavy alcoholism, sleepless nights, and the pressures of fame caused his hair to fall out faster than his age warranted. Unlike many colleagues who saw wigs as a savior, Holden viewed them as a crown of thorns, a symbol of the Hollywood fakery he had grown to despise. On the salon set, Holden was frequently irritable, even exploding without cause. The crew thought it was the pressure of the role. The truth was much simpler. He was being tortured by the very camouflage on his head. There were days when the moment the director yelled, "Cut," Holden would rip the hairpiece off and throw it on the table, venting his rage at the object he was forced to wear. In PR photos carefully retouched by Paramount, Holden remained America's dream lover. But behind the lens was a tired man who no longer believed in his own image. For audiences who have seen enough of life's ups and downs, Holden's story isn't about vanity. It is the tragedy of a man trapped between his true self and the image the money-making machine forced him to maintain. A hairpiece cannot save an aura when the belief inside has collapsed. And if Holden is proof of the illusion cracking, the next man shows just how sophisticated Hollywood's control of reality could be. 8. Spencer Tracy, The Art of Artificial Aging. A closed meeting room at MGM Studios, late 1940s. There was no panic, no complaining. Only notes charts and a plan drawn up as carefully as a military campaign. The issue on the table, Spencer Tracy, Hollywood's most respected actor, was beginning to bald at the crown. MGM's solution was not to hide the truth, but to control it. Instead of slapping a thick wig on Tracy, which would shatter his natural image, the makeup department created dozens of hairpieces with minute variations. The first piece added just a few strands at the sides. The next was slightly thicker. The crown remained thin. The hair color was adjusted, graying gradually over the years. The result was a perfect psychological magic trick. Audiences watching Father of the Bride or Bad Day at Black Rock believed they were witnessing the natural aging process of a seasoned man. What they called authentic acting was in reality supported by camouflage techniques so sophisticated they were invisible. Tracy understood the rules of the game. He didn't like it, but he accepted it. He knew the audience needed a father figure, an aged and reliable hero, not a senile old man. Tracy was so private that almost no one besides Katharine Hepburn ever saw him completely remove the disguise. Spencer Tracy's story exposes an uncomfortable truth in Hollywood: naturalness. isn't about being raw, it is about intervention so perfect that no one notices it. But if Tracy aged according to a pre-written script, the next man reveals a colder reality some were considered property from day one. 9. Robert Taylor, the asset named the perfect face. In MGM's personnel archives, Robert Taylor was not merely an actor, but a fixed asset to be protected and exploited like any profitable investment. Hailed as the man with the most perfect face in Hollywood, Taylor virtually lost ownership of his own appearance the day he signed his contract. The irony is that Taylor's hairpiece story began when he wasn't bald at all. In the early 1930s, studio executives decided his natural hairline was too high, lacking the sharpness required for a box office idol. Immediately, orders were issued to use small hairpieces and hairline painting techniques to create a flawless widow's peak, sharp as a sculpture. Taylor was not allowed to cut his own hair, change his part, or experiment with his image. Every millimeter of his forehead belonged to an approved blueprint designed to maximize box office returns. When his real hair began to thin with age, wearing a full wig was no longer a choice, but an unconditional reflex of a man accustomed to living as a product. To the audience, Robert Taylor is a ruthless testament to the dark side of capitalism in art. When appearance becomes investment capital, the human being slowly fades away. Taylor didn't wear a wig out of vanity or fear, but because he was an asset of a system that allowed no damage. And from that absolute control, Hollywood moved to another form of obsession, where the artist binds himself to perfection. 10. Fred Astaire, the spin and the fear of centrifugal force. RKO Studios. The music of Cheek to Cheek swells and Fred Astaire begins to glide across the dance floor with a lightness that makes the audience forget human bodies must obey gravity. But inside Astaire's mind, alongside the rhythm and steps, existed a cold calculation centrifugal force, sweat and the grip of wig adhesive. Astaire began balding at 24, far too young for a dancer whose very existence was defined by elegance. For him, a bald head wasn't just an aesthetic issue. It was a technical error that broke the overall line of the body under stage lights. But the biggest challenge lay in the fact that Astaire didn't stand still. He spun, leaped, and slid with an intensity that made sweat pour like rain. To solve this problem, Astaire and his team tested various heat and water-resistant industrial adhesives, designing hairpieces with unprecedented grip. His famous top hat wasn't just style, it was a psychological safety latch, giving him confidence during dangerous spins. Astaire was notoriously perfectionist, willing to scrap an expensive take if he spotted the slightest gap between the hairpiece and his scalp. For audiences who have lived long enough to understand the value of discipline, Fred Astaire emerges as a different symbol of Hollywood masculinity. Freedom and lightness on screen were traded for a pressure of control, bordering on obsession behind the scenes. He reminds us that to look truly effortless, sometimes a man must carry a burden on his head that no one is allowed to see. 11. Bob Hope, the hair that never aged with time. Some men age before the public eye, and some seem to stand still in time. Bob Hope belonged to the latter. For over 6 decades, from World War II radio programs to his final television specials, his appearance remained virtually unchanged. The familiar grin, the quick wit, and a head of hair that audiences believed was always there. The truth is, Bob Hope began wearing hairpieces in the early 1940s before he even turned 40. In an industry where comedy relies heavily on familiarity, Hope understood that his image wasn't just physical appearance. It was an emotional brand. Audiences didn't come to Bob Hope to be surprised. They came to be reassured. And a drastic change in appearance would shatter that comfort. Unlike romantic leads, Bob Hope's hairpieces didn't need to be seductive, but they had to be absolutely consistent. He kept virtually the same hairstyle for decades, to the point where it became a visual logo. Hollywood backstories tell us that Hope had an entire inventory of identical hairpieces rotated and secretly replaced as they wore out, so the audience never noticed the transition. Interestingly, during private performances for the troops, Bob Hope would occasionally use his own hairpiece as the butt of a joke. But on national television, absolutely not. Self-deprecation was only allowed in safe spaces. Before the public, his image had to be immutable. For older readers, Bob Hope represents a rare form of soft power, the power of familiarity. His hairpiece didn't hide weakness, it hid change. And in a volatile world, that was what the audience needed more than the truth. But if Bob Hope kept his hair to stand still in time, the next man had to hide his changes because of an identity tied to class and lineage. 12. Douglas Fairbanks, Jr. aristocrats are not allowed to decay. Douglas Fairbanks Jr. was born with an advantage few in Hollywood possessed a legendary surname. But that name came with an invisible burden. As the son of the iconic hero Fairbanks Sr., he didn't just have to act well. He had to look worthy of the lineage. After World War II, as Fairbanks Jr. entered middle age, his hair began to thin noticeably. For an actor often cast as gentlemen, officers, or characters of high society, balding wasn't just a cosmetic issue. It was a sign of class decay, something unacceptable in the visual logic of Hollywood at the time. Unlike many peers, Fairbanks Jr. didn't try to rejuvenate himself. His hairpieces were subtle, modest, and gradually grayed over the years. He didn't hide it, but he never spoke of it either. In Fairbanks' world, discretion was style. Those around him knew, but no one mentioned it. Stylists once remarked that Fairbanks Jr. approached hairpieces the way an English gentleman chose a suit. It had to fit perfectly, be of high quality, and never become a topic of conversation. He understood that his image didn't belong to him personally, but to a long-standing system of symbols. For mature readers, Fairbanks Jr. evokes a subtle truth. Not all concealment stems from shame. Sometimes it comes from the responsibility to uphold an image larger than oneself. If Fairbanks Jr. represented polite concealment, the next man chose to face his hairpiece with a nonchalance bordering on indifference. 13. Sean Connery, the man who dared to drop the disguise. Sean Connery began balding at a very young age, even before he became James Bond. When Dr. No premiered in 1962, audiences saw a perfect spy with thick, seductive masculine hair, but that was the product of a wig adhesive and a strict image control system. Throughout the Bond films, Connery wore a hairpiece not because he believed in it, but because the character of Bond required it. At this point, the wig was a prop, just like the Walther PPK or the tuxedo. But by the early 1970s, when Connery grew tired of being typecast, he made a rare decision in Hollywood. He stopped hiding. In The Offense, 1973, Connery appeared with a visibly bald head. It wasn't resignation. It was a declaration of new power. He no longer needed to maintain the Bond illusion. Remarkably, his career didn't collapse. Instead, he entered a new phase where masculinity was linked to authority and life experience, no longer to hair. Connery demonstrated a rare fact: only when a man possesses enough power is he allowed to remove the camouflage. But not everyone wants to remove it. For the next man, artificiality became part of the performance. 14. Cesar Romero, when fakery is no longer something to hide. Cesar Romero never tried to convince the audience that his hair was real. As his career moved into its later stages, his hairpiece became increasingly obvious, especially in his role as the Joker in the 1960s Batman series. And surprisingly, the audience accepted it. Romero began losing hair quite early, but unlike his colleagues, he didn't view it as a tragedy. For an actor accustomed to playing Latin lovers, dashing gentlemen, and theatrical characters, a wig was simply part of the costume. Backstage stories say that Romero would often adjust his hairpiece right on set without needing privacy. He understood one thing clearly: when you don't try to hide, others lose the reason to scrutinize. By the time he played the Joker, the artificiality of the hair fit perfectly with the exaggerated and surreal tone of the comic book world. Romero taught a different lesson: not all fakery needs to be covered up. Sometimes accepting it publicly strips it of its weight. From that nonchalance, Hollywood arrived at a complete reversal with the final figure. 15. Yul Brynner. Ultimate power lies in the right to choose. Yul Brynner is the greatest paradox on this list. He didn't wear a wig because he was bald. On the contrary, he had hair and actively chose to shave it off. That decision, starting with the role of King Mongkut in The King, and in 1956, turned Brynner into a distinct symbol of power. In a Hollywood where everyone tried to hide, balding Brynner chose to expose it. His bald head didn't suggest weakness, it suggested dominance. Ironically, when a role required hair, Brynner would wear a wig with complete comfort. To Brynner, hair, whether present or absent, was merely an image choice. He controlled it. He wasn't controlled by it, and that very agency created true power. If the previous 14 men had to hide to survive, Brynner survived because he had the right to choose. And that is the strongest conclusion to this entire story. They weren't afraid of going bald. They were afraid of losing the right to be desired. Looking back at the 15 men who defined Hollywood masculinity for nearly a century, what remains is not the fact that they wore wigs, but the reason why they were forced to do so. In the Golden Age, hair wasn't just about appearance. It was about power allure and the capacity to be desired. The studio system taught audiences to believe in a version of men that didn't exist, and simultaneously forced those very men to live their entire lives within their roles. Wigs ultimately are just the surface of a deeper story about control, the fear of being replaced, and the price of glory. They didn't hide out of vanity, they hid to survive in a world that didn't allow men to age or weaken in public. If you find the stories behind these lights worth reflecting on, hit like, subscribe, and leave a comment about which figure surprised you the most, because Hollywood still has many secrets left to tell.